start. I'm delighted to be here and introduce and moderate this panel on disruptive technologies and how they apply to the pharmaceutical value chain. I'm fascinated by what is happening in the technology space, and I'm even more fascinated by what is happening in the pharmaceutical space, in embracing some of these technologies or rejecting them. And I think it's a nice segue, the panel that we had previous to this one. There was a lot of discussion around, is pharma really embracing disruption, and to what extent that is happening. I'm fascinated about the gap that I see between aspiration and reality as well. So I think the ethos and the tone of this will be very much around, okay, let's see what is possible, but also let's see what is real. We will touch upon a number of different technologies and topics, ranging from AI and big data all the way to blockchain and automation in the manufacturing space, as well as 3D printing. We're a very distinguished panel of speakers coming from different parts of the ecosystem, and we also are delighted to have somebody who is not in healthcare, who can provide an outside-in perspective and has been leading and thinking about the future in his current role a lot. So without further ado, we have Brian Henry, and I'll ask the panelists to give them brief introductions about themselves and their roles and what they think is really disrupting their industry and their work. But we have Brian Henry, who is Vice President of Drug Product Design at Pfizer. We have Dominic Emery, Vice President for Long-Term Planning at BP. Mike Houghton, Managing Director of Process Industries and Drives at Siemens for the UK and Ireland. Nick Lynch, Founder and Chief Technology Officer at Pistoia Alliance. And we also have Paul Jones, who is currently Director of Population Genomics at Illumina. So welcome to all of you. Why don't we start with a quick round of introductions, and why don't we start maybe from you, Nick?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the chance to be on this panel today. Just a brief introduction. I used to work for AstraZeneca in their R&D informatics group and data science, leading teams there for about 12 years. And then since then, I've been involved in setting up an SME in the UK, which does support for pharma in that way. And then, as well as doing that, I've been working a lot on pre-competitive activities. We already heard the talk from Natalie around IMI, and have been involved in a number of IMI projects from the UK, as well as helping to support the Pistoia Alliance, which is a global not-for-profit group that's looking at building pre-competitive activities across the pharma value chain, particularly focusing on data and focusing on standards, because we believe that in a way for the pharma industry to be continually successful and to build where it's going from, it is that we need to collaborate a lot more, because there are so many challenges that we can't solve on our own, and that we see that there are many things that we can do collaboratively in projects through networking to hopefully really benefit the whole industry. So we'll welcome questions and points on how we can work better as an industry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. My name is Paul Jones. I am a director at Illumina, and so focused around the genomics agenda. My background is in and around pharma over the last 30 or so years, working with companies like Astra and Sanofi and Novartis. Actually, a few years ago now, I spent a little bit of time in consulting. I spent a little bit of time with IMS, and actually, most recently, in the last few years, I've started to focus really around the genomics agenda, and I had the pleasure of being involved in the privilege, I should say, of being involved in the 100,000 Genomes project in the UK, really running that interface into pharma and biotech, and indeed the broader commercial agenda at the 100,000 Genomes project, which is just about to deliver on that promise of 100,000 genomes and starting to scale. You may have heard up to the next level of 5 million aspiration, certainly over the next few years. So a mixed background, always with a keen interest in data, always with a keen interest in innovation, and always actually focused around this interface into the healthcare agenda. So that's one of the themes that I'd like to reinforce today. Dominic.
Thank you. My name's Dominic Emery. I'm responsible for strategy and strategic planning at BP, and this is my first pharma conference, so I'll be very interested to hear what the sort of commonalities and overlaps are. The big challenge for us in the energy industry is what we call the dual challenge, and this is about supplying energy to a growing population, a population that's moving out of lower incomes into middle incomes, We anticipate about 20% energy growth over the coming couple of decades, but at the same time we have this climate change imperative and the need to reduce emissions by about 50% over that period of time. So I would say it's actually the kind of defining issue of the kind of the time in energy. And so we've developed a strategy which is primarily focused on how can we begin to decarbonize our energy portfolio, our core oil and gas businesses, but also trying to understand the role that disruptive technologies may play, both in support of the core businesses, but also creating new and different and distinctive businesses, be they in the digital space, be they in the bio-product space, and also continuing to grow our renewable and alternative energy businesses in solar and in wind. So we've had a corporate venture capital unit for some time now and have been kind of investing in trying to understand disruption. And one of the kind of paradoxes around disruption, you actually have to be quite systematic to think about it and to invest in it. And I hope there's some sort of similar kind of lessons that I can learn from this conference from my fellow panelists about how we lean into disruption and how we can benefit from understanding disruption and actually put it to good use and build new businesses out of it.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Brian Henry. I work for Pfizer. I'm based at the Sandwich site on Discovery Park down in the southeast of the UK. My day job really is leading the drug product design group. It's a small molecule group, so although I have an interest in advanced therapies, cell therapies and gene therapies, it's amazing to see what's going on there. But I'm going to be speaking more from a small molecule perspective, just to give you that just so you know that's where I'll be coming from the start. I think the biggest challenge we've got in our space is actually accelerated development. You know, a lot of programs are getting fast filings now. We can get exceptional data in very specialist patient populations very early. It's gone beyond oncology and cancer now into rare diseases, orphan diseases, and into some other areas which I would have historically I thought were more traditional diseases, but you can still get accelerated filings. So for the drug discoverer and developer, that's shortening your timelines, whereas you used to have maybe 6, 7, 8, 10 years in development. You had phase 1, you had phase 2, you had phase 3. We're squeezing all that down now. And we're doing it very successfully, but we're doing it through perhaps the old way of working and sheer effort, which you can do as a peak, as a one-off. You can muster the troops and you can rally around a strategic priority. But now it's the norm. So I'm really looking for disruptive technologies and different ways of working. I sort of want to have my cake and eat it. I want to do it fast and more efficiently as well. And I think that's what we're looking for in the small molecule world specifically as our big disruptor going forward.
Thank you.
So my name's Mike Horton. I'm Managing Director of Siemens Process Industries and Drives Group. That's for UK and Ireland. So I essentially look after a number of vertical sectors, chemical, pharmaceutical, water, wastewater, a whole host. We have a number of factories here in the UK, so I not only have our own factories that I had to deal with, I also supply products and services into other manufacturing facilities, and Pharma's just one of those. Outside my day job, I also chair the all-party parliamentary group for the process sector and engineering. I also chair the advanced manufacturing for Northwest, particularly on a Liverpool focus. You might be able to tell by the accent, by the way, native British. And that's why that's important for today, really, is that's where the national adoption pilot is being piloted for the Made Smarter review. You remember we talked about those industrial challenges earlier. So that's how we drive industrial digitalization technologies into the manufacturing sector more successfully. And on top of the day job as well, if I didn't have enough, I also am running 2 startups for Siemens, and that's been quite a challenge in terms of the disruption it's given to my standard business practices. One's in, it's called Utilities as a Service, and the other one is in a biofarm working in Southern Ireland at Nibert, big data. So I'll probably field questions later on this.
Fantastic. What a great panel. Let me just start with one question to you, Dominic. If you want to, you alluded to it before, what are the differences and similarities between healthcare and energy? And I think, one could argue that they're both very regulated, relatively capital intensive, very strategic sectors. And on the other hand, you have all these technologies that are really sector agnostic, that are reshaping, industries and disrupting industry or enhancing industries. But one key question I have for you is, how do you plan, or can you plan for disruption? Can you really anticipate, and how do you deal with a core business that is challenged, that needs renewal? So how do you really deal with these forces, and can you really plan?
I would say a few years ago, when the oil price was around $100 a barrel, we kind of felt, rather complacently, that it would continue that way, and we had a single kind of deterministic plan, which kind of looked like the world was going to continue the same for forever, which is a crazy way to plan. And so now we have a very different approach to planning. We actually look at a range of different scenarios, and we test our strategy against that range of different scenarios. And those scenarios will include a very significant component of the Paris Climate Agreement. It will also include the new reality, which is there is more oil and gas discovered in the world than the world actually needs. And so how do you actually kind of put those things together and actually create a kind of a strategy for growth? And also, how do we understand the kind of disruptive forces of renewable and alternative energy, and also some of the cross-cutting themes, particularly around the kind of the digital agenda. And if I focus on that a little bit, what we've sought to do is, rather than sort of be overwhelmed by disruption, as I said earlier, the paradox is that you actually have to be quite systematic about it, and you have to try and think about what are the areas where you're going to kind of focus on trying to understand where disruption comes from. And so for us, we've tried to kind of funnel the activity into 5 broad areas. One is around digital, and we have both internally, we have an approach which is looking at digital agility on the inside to enhance our operational activity. So this will include a range of things that you'll all be very familiar with around big data and around artificial intelligence, and also around the use of blockchain on the inside of our activity, and using blockchain, for example, to start to characterize the provenance of different sorts of molecules, low emissions gas, for example, or different kind of biomolecules that go into our biofuels. So that's an area that we think is actually both interesting and potentially quite differentiating, because frankly, gas is gas, oil is oil. If you can start to differentiate those products in such a way, then it could become quite competitively advantaged. As well as using artificial intelligence, we're looking at a lot of kind of remote sensing and the use of kind of satellite imagery for kind of detection of leakages on some of our operations. And starting to create ways of running operations actually not by being next to the kit. So the creation of what we call a digital twin of our kind of operational activity, which has had amazing results in terms of efficiency across the piece. And then we also have the customer-facing digital opportunities, which again will lie around things like blockchain. So we think there's a possibility that the use of kind of blockchain for peer-to-peer energy trading could start to really deflate our kind of business model. So if you imagine a world of plenty in terms of energy, customers being able to kind of exchange energy between themselves, kind of you and I being able to kind of manage energy from our one home to another, it could have a massive deflationary effect on the cost of energy and our ability to trade. So they're the kind of disruptions that we see coming out quite significantly at the moment that has some sort of commonality with the life sciences and pharma industry.
That's great. So you can really plan for it, but you need to be systematic about it and have scenario planning in some ways. Absolutely. So that's great. Yeah. And yet you need to make big capital commitments at the same time, which lock you in for a number of different years. So maybe turning to you, Mike, investing in plants and manufacturing is something that you do once, and then how do you keep it current? How do you keep that capital delivering?
Well, if I can answer that by building on what Dominic said, actually. He mentioned there about digital twin and the effect that it had on his business in terms of the operational side. If you think about the compelling needs, most businesses have this challenge, and I'm going to put oil and gas into the same category as pharma in some senses before the oil price crash. As every year you have an escalating price increase for some reason, whether it be wage inflation, whatever it might be. Normally cost for production goes up. And in any other business, what you have is you have a similar challenge year on year, where new competitors are coming into your market and driving your price down, Oil and gas, and particularly drugs that are in patents, don't suffer this same issue year on year in quite the same way as a lot of other manufacturers. I wouldn't say they don't suffer it at all, but so these other manufacturers are forced to try and close that gap every year. So you've got to drive a productivity improvement year on year. And if I look at automotive, for instance, they'll operate on about 11% a year, some of them. If I look at my own manufacturing sites, I'm operating at about 7% a year on year improvement. I can only do that so much by just driving productivity using standard lean techniques and the likes. You get to a point where you've just squeezed that sponge so far, you can get no more out of it, and you need to invest in some sort of technology. And we invest in a digital twin. So if I look at my manufacturing site south of Manchester in Congleton, we produce a variable speed drive there. And that drive, we can produce a bespoke drive just for you at the same price we can produce a drive that we'd make 1,000 SKUs of. And we can only do it using digitalisation. So it really is important to embrace this. Now, how can you adopt it? I don't think it's... Years gone by, it was always a big bang. You've got to embrace digitalisation wholly from start to end. I think, you know, that's proven to be quite a challenge. You've seen a lot of SAP and type of large ERP systems that have struggled with this. We've gone for a very iterative, agile approach of delivering incremental improvements in an agile fashion, and that's proven to be quite successful. But it is challenging, and you need everyone behind it.
Great. Now, I would like to shift gears a little bit and talk about big data and AI, which you both talked about. Undoubtedly, I mean, AI is one of the most talked about technology and hype technology out there. But I do wonder how well, certainly it's artificial. I would wonder how intelligent AI is today. And certainly it feeds off big data. So the topic of AI and big data is interesting. And there's no shortage of data and exponentially growing out there in healthcare. So I do wonder, what is this fuss about? I mean, Nick, what is this all about, AI and big data? How real is it today?
I mean, I think you picked up on some good points already, and I think we've heard earlier from today's speakers that, you know, the nature of AI is probably how people can come up with many different definitions. And I think we're at in a way, a perfect storm, both in terms of our compute capability, which is in a way one of the factors which has driven this, as well as you said, the sheer growth of data that either we're choosing to collect or we're collecting almost by accident because we can. And I think there's going to be tension there when we think about this in the future. But I think one way I like to think about artificial intelligence, it first of all has to go through more of an augmented intelligence approach, because, you know, we are amazing individuals in terms of what we can do with the human brain, and to expect something to be artificial and to replace that in the short term, or even in certain aspects of our lives, is, I think, somewhat expectant. And I think that we have to plan such that these changes are going to be far more incremental. You know, science has long had a great pedigree of using things like good statistics, machine learning, and that's a great sort of early growth of what is now perhaps badged as AI. But we have a long way to go. And that, you know, we talk about the data, but we also need to talk about the quality of that data, because that, in a way, is what's going to drive a good model. So the things that we see, you know, working well with AI today, whether that be, you know, a recommendation thing on Amazon, has been trained because it's had access to some, you know, a large volume of data, and that data is pretty well structured because it's about a book or a product, and there's no complexity of human biology there. So I think we're going to see, you know, in sort of an incremental approach to AI, very much it being supplementary to the individual, the scientist, the clinician, the doctor, and us as individuals. So I think we very much have to think of this as a journey, and we have to focus on what's going to enhance the AI development, and that really is the data. And it's also our skills to be quizzical and be skeptical about the role of AI. And in a way, the hype couldn't probably get any bigger. You know, you add a .ai to your domain name, and you immediately, you know, add 10 times to the value of your company. But I think we're going to have to step away from that a little bit, and in a way avoid this sort of the winter of AI, which probably hit us 10 years ago, to be sort of building on success and building in domains, you know, bit by bit, rather than tackling the whole approach, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense to me. So you touched upon the quality aspects. I mean, big data, though, Paul, maybe you've worked with big data. You are working with big data. You're certainly adding to the data sets.
We are.
Is that really accelerating? Well, first of all, what is your view about big data? What do we really mean by big data? But also, is this really helping drug discovery, accelerating drug discovery?
Well,
or other aspects of healthcare?
so we do generate big data. Yeah, we're one contributor to that big data agenda from a genomics perspective. But I think if I take a step back and just look at a framework for how I've thought over the years about how data is managed, I think there needs to be a cycle or a flow associated with it. And I think the idea that you might generate data but it isn't connected anywhere is a key challenge. And so for me, there's a theme around making sure if you're going to generate it, you need to be able to connect it in so that people can access it. And so that would be the first kind of cycle in my mind. Once you've collected the data, you've connected it to a network, I think you then need to think about how people might get access to it. And I don't necessarily mean by shifting data into a large data warehouse. And I think increasingly in healthcare, there's some sensitivity around the movement of data. And so there's this principle around that I would describe as being a kind of an exchange mechanism that allows the data to stay where it is once it's generated and connected to the network, but that allows you to be able to view it as if it was part of a single data warehouse. And that multiple federated approach around exchange, I think, is extremely valuable, that then leads into the agenda around the analytics and the AI piece, that then says, that's what you might do if you can access large data sets wherever they may come from and exchange them appropriately. But actually, until you've done something with it, it doesn't offer any value. And so the principle for me is about if you can connect, if you can exchange, if you can analyze, what about acting on it? What difference are you going to make, whether it's applying it to the pharma value chain or indeed in healthcare? What is it that's going to be the value that you're driving to achieve? And for me, that kind of framework helps whichever industry or sector you may come from is a useful way of thinking about the big data challenge, but also where the different components of it might fit together.
And does it really help with drug discovery? I mean, there's a lot of hype there around. Who don't know who wants to take this, but has it really accelerated drug discovery? Do we have examples today of AI-driven drug discovery that has made a difference? I don't know, maybe Nick or anyone.
I'm happy to go first. I mean, I think we're yet to see perhaps a pure AI-driven molecule, but then that's to say that, many molecules in the past have been based on some in silico work. So I think it's not going to be necessarily a revolution at this point. It's going to be more evolutionary. I think where big data and AI can help in a way is partly proving the hypothesis, but equally disproving it. So in a way, the nature of drug discovery is as much trying to find the needle in the haystack as avoiding taking, negative turns. And so I think the role, as Paul has said about the value of data, it can help, with that sort of acceleration and the volume aspects of AI, that it can process much larger aspects than a single human, that we will see some acceleration to this, but it's still going to be, step by step, rather than it being this molecule has been based on an AI approach, because I think that's some way off even now. And just picking up on what Paul said about connectivity, I think that's really critical around the ability to preserve privacy while still allowing data to be shared. And maybe that's something that we can talk about later.
Any other comments on the accessibility, quality of data exchanges?
So for me, I think there's lots of point solutions that have worked really well. So if you look in the world of material sciences and solid form conformation, connecting crystal structures to crystal structure databases is well established now and is now just routine. So that's transformed our view as to how we find the right solid form. If you look at some examples we have internally where we're taking away the sort of magic spectroscopist's eye when they're looking at spectra and making judgments. We've seen some really nice examples where an AI approach is helping us. But the spots, what I've not really seen is things that go across a whole variety of different domains and linking them together. So just trying to get data from a research organisation and a commercial organisation to speak and flow. So, my group's designing medicines to be manufactured at commercial scale. Can I get the information to flow from what we've given to the commercial organisation to come back and help them refine it? Things like that are very, very difficult. So lots of good spot solutions, but the systems-based, systems-wide is just starting to come, I think.
Marco, I think one of the things that's interesting is when you look at not just what the data and the technology can do, but what processes change as a result of it. And the example that we used to use when I was at Genomics England was this principle. If you look at the way, let's just use clinical trial development as an example, where PIs are identified. You know, the hope is that patients go through those PIs, they get recruited over time, and it takes multiple months, if not years, to just basically get sufficient number of patients in to recruit to trial. One of the principles we were looking at with the 100,000 Genomes Project, and it was still a concept, but it's very much the principle of using big data to change that process and that structure, is saying, imagine instead of relying on the recruitment around multiple PI centres in a country and indeed across countries, what if there was a single data repository that was nationally held, maybe still federated across centres, but in essence allowed you access with the molecular profiles already in place, with the phenotypes and clinical data accessible, so that when a company like a pharma company is looking to recruit to trial, instead of going through the painful process of recruiting to phase 2, phase 3, as we've done in the past, potentially with the flick of a digital switch, you can access where those patients are in the country, have the right consent to be able to re-engage them. And it fundamentally changes the processes that are associated with the way things used to be done and the way they could be done in the future. And for me, it's always about, well, what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve? And the technology can be used to support that, and that should always come second.
Well, that's very interesting, and I think you mentioned, Brian, integrating data sets within a company is already quite challenging, because we have large structures and institutions that are working very much as well in silos. So I do wonder, integrating external data makes it even harder, I suppose. Dominic, I don't know, from your experience in BP, I mean, you're generating a lot of data as well, you're processing a lot of data. How are you dealing with this integration challenge within a large company?
So I would say that we've only really exploited a kind of an absolute pinprick of all the data that gets generated. And so the beginning of big data was to try and look for certain operational correlations, not necessarily understand the fundamental science behind them, but to see what was actually emerging so that we start to make operational interventions. Then we've taken it to the next level and started to use machine interventions. That has been quite successful. But then the quality of the data is only as good as the way you kind of sense it. And so we've started to put more kind of sensors on a lot of our wells around our kind of refineries. And that's providing yet another level of data which we can both use from a data analytical big data point of view, which is primarily focused on the correlations, and then subsequently to use the, if you like, the machine learning to make machine-led interventions, or at least to inform operators to make the appropriate level of intervention. The other area that we're getting quite excited about is the use of artificial intelligence and cognitive computing for vehicle autonomy. So as we move from kind of electric vehicles into autonomous vehicles, that is going to have to be the kind of the most real of real-time kind of interventions in terms of artificial intelligence. So so that's another area that we're quite excited about.
Great. I think, Mike, maybe turning to you on and changing a little bit the topic and talking about blockchain. I mean, that's another buzzword. I'm actually not sure many people are able to define exactly what blockchain is. It's a bit like it's easy, everybody's mouth, but it's not that straightforward. And maybe the technology itself is straightforward. It's just the application of it that is unclear. And certainly, my question to you is, in manufacturing or in any other parts of the pharmaceutical value chain, how much is blockchain really considered? Is it taken up? Does it return on the investment or not?
So in one of the startups I mentioned earlier, blockchain is actively being pursued. So just to give you the backdrop to this is that we're moving to, instead of just selling product as we sold it in the past, you've got to consider data as equally as valuable as the product of old. And that's, so you think of it as the new oil, that's the way a lot of people describe it now. And with that data, you know, proving the provenance of it becomes really challenging, particularly if you're going to use that data to build people for interventions against. So let me give you an idea. If you can come up with a constellation where you fund a particular capital investment and you're funding that investment through your ability to manage the risk around big data analysis, so you can say, we think we can get a return on that investment through these interventions, and improve the productivity of that customer's assets, through those interventions. We'll be paid for out of those savings that we make, and then the customer gets really interested in, so I want you to prove to me you've actually saved that money, saved that intervention, saved something for me, or improved the yield in some way. That's when they're saying, you know, they want to see blockchain in there. And by the way, some of these interventions might be very small, so it's impracticable to expect some order processing to sit behind this and verify it. There's going to be lots of these interventions happening all the time, or there isn't in one of my instances. And that's a great example of where the customer's saying, actually, I see real benefit in that. In the past, people have accepted data, but you know, that's no longer acceptable if you're getting large amount of transitions in the back of that to just pass on a data file in the past. I just touch on something else you mentioned earlier about data in different systems. We deal with data all the time, and we've never collected as much data as we collect today. So we talk about big data. To give you a perspective, more data was collected last year than was ever collected before. And only about 0.1% of that data was actually analysed. And then you get into it. So you've got lots of data, but it tends to be in what we call data jails. You can get access to it, but it might take you time. You might need to get some dispensation. You've got this data, but you can only look at it for these reasons. You've got to delete it in this fashion after such a period. It becomes a real challenge.
So data is definitely new oil, but it needs refining, I hear, and
yeah.
to be put to proper use.
It does, yeah. But I guess the key to it is when you talk about AI and you talk about data, whatever else it might be, you've got to really get to the root of what is the question that you want answering. Lots of people say, I want big data, but what do you want to do with the data?
Correct. So I think that you're touching upon a very important, I don't know, maybe it's the minimal viable data set that we're talking about. We don't necessarily need all this data all the time.
Yeah.
And maybe then the exchange mechanism, indeed, sourcing the right data at the right time to answer the specific question is a way forward. But then blockchain, do we really need blockchain to secure this data or to validate it, or for security, integrity reasons? Why do we need blockchain? Can it not be done in other ways?
I mean, it's provenance at the end of the day. It's a provenance question that we're asked. And if we need to prove provenance, that's when we use blockchain.
Okay.
And we do.
Very good. Brian, maybe, actually, I have one more question to you, Mike, if you may. We talked about manufacturing and automation. It's a very hot topic as well. I mean, maybe slightly provocatively, I think you referred to the car industry and how Elon Musk has been really rethinking the way manufacturing works in the automotive industry, etc. How far are we really from 100% automation? How far away are we from 100% automation? Will we ever get there? Is it a desirable goal, first of all, or not?
Okay, so well, it's a great question, Marco. If I look at let's consider pharmaceutical versus automotive in terms of their approach to automation. It's miles apart. The pharmaceutical industry could make a massive step change, forgetting about this is manufacturing side, in terms of their cost reduction, right, and their improved quality if they adopted automation to the level of like an automotive manufacturer right now. But there's a lot of conservativeness in manufacturing in the pharma industry that stop it from adopting these, I'm going to say, a lot of standard automation processes. So whether you wanted 100% or not, you could probably reduce the costs by material amounts right now if you just adopted what's available right now. Good. Bit provocative, I'm sorry.
No, and that ties into the supply chain. Supply chain are globalized today, right? So you can manufacture things everywhere. And I think you mentioned to me that it's probably cheaper to fish a salmon in Scotland, ship it, freeze it, ship it to China for filleting, freeze it again, bring it back, and then selling it to the consumer. So is that really true, first of all? Or
it is true. Well, this was about global trade. We're no longer competing against line-of-sight shores. We're competing on a global level. And the salmon farmer in Scotland, it's cheaper for him to freeze it, send it to China, have it processed, repackaged, send it back to Scotland than what it is for him to process it in Scotland. And that's the competitiveness you're up against right now. And that's why you've got to drive competitiveness at every level of your manufacturing process. Because if you don't, you become irrelevant very quickly.
Very good. One thing that is fascinating, besides, let's say, manufacturing, is also designing drugs and technologies that can be applied to design drugs in different ways, maybe more cost effectively. But Brian, this is a question to you, really. I mean, how far away are we? Another challenging question, from 3D printing of drugs, and is that really, again, desirable, possible, or not, or are we just talking about other technologies?
Can I just come on to automation?
Perfect. Yeah,
So I think the biggest challenge the big transformation we've had actually is going from batch manufacturing. As an industry, we batch manufacture. We do small batches, we then make a big batch, we then transfer it somewhere else in the world and do it all again. So that stepwise process is probably, when we had the time and the money, we could do it. So I think the move from batch to continuous manufacture is the big move from us. Not quite automation, but I'm seeing that in the tablet capsule filling world, and we're seeing it more and more in the chemistry, process sciences as well. So I think that's where we're going to go. There's lots of conservatism there, I'd say mainly within the companies, actually, rather than we jump quite quickly on the regulators. I think a lot of the concerns we have actually sit within the company. But for me, that's the big move, and that's potentially one of those efficiency drivers. As an industry, we could get our arms around. You solve the scale-up problem and you solve the tech transfer problem, and that's where a lot of our inefficiencies sit. So I think that's probably, and that's here and now. Our first product is going to be available, made with our first continuous manufacturing plant any minute now. Watch out for the press releases in the next few weeks. We're very proud of that.
That's very good. Paul, you want to?
One of the things I was fascinated with, I don't know if people have heard of this idea of adjacent possibles. Stephen Johnson talks in his book about where do good ideas come from. When you have innovation in one space, how it opens the doors to the rest of the house, if you like, if that was seen as a front door. And for me, when you see some innovation like we've seen in genomics, where the price has come down, the turnaround time has been compressed, and it just opens up a world that previously would not have been opened around consumer genomics and liquid biopsy and population genomics, whatever associated markets are almost derived from the initial innovation that just unlocks huge amounts of innovation from there. And that's, for me, a fascinating concept. And it crosses industries, but that adjacent possibles principle, for me, we've got a long way to go in terms of identifying how that might be explored.
Is 3D printing adjacent, Brian? Or is it really out there?
Yeah, it's there. There is a product approved. It's been available in the US for a couple of years now. I don't know how well it's doing, but that was the first product that actually was made by an additive manufacturer, which is a form of printing technology. It's certainly there. If you go and speak to the universities, you can get tablets made. You can get multi-component tablets, you can get slow release, multi-release, so it's there. I think the proof of principle has been agreed. The technology is more or less right. In fact, we're blessed in the UK with groups at Nottingham and UCL and groups at MIT in the US leading the way there. So it can be done. I think what you've got to ask yourself is why. Additive manufacture, it's got to add some value. We're not actually struggling to make tablets. So you need to think about why you're doing it, what purpose are you doing it for. The thought of having a pharmacy printer sat in your local community pharmacy making tablets is a long way off, I think. What we are seeing potentially is uses in some of our early clinical trials where we want a more flexible, adaptable approach. You want to be able to dose a patient, see the response, adjust and change, and dose again the following couple of days. That's doable. That could be done now. I think it's more around the quality control, the assurance aspects, because you don't want to end up having to make a couple hundred tablets to test them before you can release them. So you need to be able to make it and dose your volunteer and patient, and I think that's probably the biggest challenge at the moment. But it's there, it's doable. But I would challenge everyone to think about what are you trying to fix? What are you making better? If you're talking about printing tablets, there's it's going to be there. I think very niche areas first, and that will obviously be the pioneer. That will break some of the barriers. It resolves some of the technology issues we need to do. And from then,
Brian, how do you get that to scale? How do you get that to be beyond just piloting on a small scale? That's the thing I've always been fascinated with. How do you adopt it across a whole industry?
Yeah. Well, I come back to why. The cost of making tablets is very safe, very mature technology. It's a question of why would you want to do it. People have talked about connecting patient-focused medicines and really zooming in on a patient tablet just for you sort of process. I don't think the clinical understanding's there, the regulatory understanding's not there, so I think a lot more other things would have to move before you could answer that question.
I wanted to allow for some questions here.
There are also situations where they develop parallel the tablet, but also they have the 3D printing. This is a lot of interest in the Department of Defense in the States, because they have to dispatch it in situations that there is a bioterror or situations like that where they need quickly a limited amount of medicine. So they just announced that FDA and the Department of Defense actually they have now new agreements to go exactly to 3D continuous manufacturing very small scale.
We're looking at a research grant with NASA at the moment who are saying if you really want to put humans on Mars, you're going to have a totally different way of making things. And again, they're pushing potentially these very novel, innovative technologies you may need in 10 years' time when you actually want to put people in different parts of the world. So maybe some of the things like that, maybe that's the driver rather than the mainstream health industry. Maybe it's going to be those niche areas where you'll pioneer it.
I wanted to open it up to questions. I have one last question before we open it up, though. It's about collaboration, cross-industry collaboration, pre-competitive, but also joint ventures, collaborations, because it does sound like that is needed, especially when it comes to disruption. Nobody can figure it out, or maybe not. Maybe it's not needed. But I'm interested in the panel's perspective on that. And maybe Dominic, you have examples of cross-industry collaboration. Paul, you've driven a lot of collaboration across the industry as well. Is it really happening? Is pharma open to it? What are the benefits or the challenges of collaborating across different companies?
Just in the last few years, the oil and gas industry has created this oil and gas climate initiative. And this was created really on the back of the Paris Climate Agreement, because it was recognized that there are a lot of technologies that seem to be very promising from a CO2 mitigation point of view, like carbon capture and storage that many of you will have heard of, that were really not getting anywhere. There was a bit of a standoff between, will governments because it's going to be, if you like, a common good, will governments fund it or do we wait on industry to fund it? And this standoff has kind of happened for some time now. And so a lot of companies, 13 of the world's largest energy companies have got together to say, look, we want to make this happen. And so we're now kind of pushing to do that. And rather than having government-led industry follow, we want to try and flip it on its head, because frankly, we're not going to be able to meet the Paris Agreement without it. So recognize that there's kind of common purpose in a sort of pre-competitive domain like this to try and create the enabling environments for that to happen. That's something we're very kind of supportive of. And we've actually created a collaborative investment fund to invest in technology to support carbon capture and storage and other CO2 reducing technologies, which we set up a couple of years ago, called the Climate Investments Fund. So it's $1 billion collaborated between 13 companies that represent about 30% of the global oil and gas production globally. So it's actually an early start, but I think it's a bit of a breakthrough in terms of how we can collaborate across our industry. And actually just in September this year, we set a collaborative target to reduce emissions across these 13 companies. And it's not just the obvious ones like Shell and BP and Total and whatnot. It also includes national oil companies like CNPC of China and Saudi Aramco. So we're really trying to drive it forward collaboratively. We hope to good effect.
Yes, Marco, so going back to the Genomics England agenda, as a national program sponsored by the government to basically create a 100,000 genome initiative over 3 years. And there was an interface into industry that was really interesting in that I spoke to each and every company, the top 25 market cap in the world, and asked them what they wanted as a model. And actually they said pre-competitive consortium would work for us. And a dozen companies came on board as part of what we call the Gene Consortium, and helped learn with Genomics England about what the requirements would be to industry in order that they would perceive this as valuable and valuable enough to pay for, an interface into a very large-scale genomic endeavour. And so for me, it was a fascinating example of experts from within multiple companies. It started with 12, but grew over time, who were working together on a monthly basis as part of a steering committee, had operational people on a daily basis accessing data, and really giving strategic advice into Genomics England about the industry requirements. And for me, that was a phenomenal example of how pre-competitive collaborations can really offer huge value, particularly in engaging with new endeavours. You know, it felt innovative, and no one company wanted to necessarily be out there alone in exploring that interface.
Yeah, and just to add to what Paul said about, I think it can be valuable at the beginning of a journey when we're exploring sort of new technologies, and I think there's already good progress there around AI and blockchain. But even when things become more commoditized, I think there's value in continuing that pre-competitive discussion, because it can sort of, as we've said about manufacturing improvement, you can still eke out further improvement by sharing, because it is even less competitive at that point. So it's trying to get the right, I think, across the value chain and across the process, pre-competitive work can add real value.
Great. I think we've touched upon a lot of different topics. So, I mean, you can pick any one of these topics, or any indeed new ones that relate to disruption. I'd like to open the floor for questions, if there are any. Please. Wait for the mic, because otherwise nobody will be able to hear you, unless you shout.
Thank you. My name is Fane from Science Entrepreneur Club. I just want to ask, is there still room for redefining new technologies, or are we completely moving from redefining old technologies?
I mean, I can have a go. I mean, I would say one on my topic is something like quantum computing, which for me, at least in my understanding of what it can do, will perhaps be a real step change in our expectation of how much we can process at any one time. And, you know, we've been used to the silicon world of chips for 30 years, 40 years, and the ability to take it to a quantum computing approach where both the speed and just what we could do, our imagination will be driven. I think that's an example where, you know, it's a step change, and I think we'll expect to see other step changes in other areas, because that's what the human race has been doing for centuries.
Yeah, I just echo that. That's an area that we're very interested in, both quantum computing and quantum sensing. The ability to actually move from the kind of the binary kind of silicon approach to something which could speed things up by so many orders of magnitude, to do kind of experiments that we couldn't possibly imagine now, that would take hundreds of millions of years to do, is completely kind of mind-blowing. So that's really a new technology that could have a dramatic effect, I think, across the world.
Can I just throw a pennyworth in there? It's quite interesting, you know, are we looking to adopt new technologies or enhance existing ones, I think was the exam question you set. Siemens has set itself a goal where we set another company up called Next 47, and it's €1 billion worth of investment funds into partnerships with small startups, medium startups, those sorts of organisations. And the reason why it's done it is quite interesting. Is whilst it's got its own R&D and its divisions, which is, you know, let's say just short of 6 billion, so it's significant, its own R&D and the divisions, but that R&D is largely around what those businesses know. Is it being disruptive enough? And there's, you know, the quote in the organisation is, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. If there is disruption out there that's going to kill off your existing business, what you know, it's probably not going to come in from inside those businesses. And that's why that group is set up specifically to attract markets where we wouldn't necessarily invest in, you know, from those core competences in the divisions, as it were. So it takes a different way of thinking to be that disruptive, to know that this is actually going to kill off half my existing business. So, but if you don't do it, someone else will.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Viraj Mehta from GSK. I have a question regarding big data. So big data are getting now not just important for the research, but also post-marketing when a drug product is launched. So the era is to have medical affairs and more data generation, real life data, so that we can compare the efficiency of a treatment or medicinal product. So how is the industrial view for that? So where would be the dotted line between the data collection and feeding back to the company who has innovated it and giving that back to the society, so for the other companies who are innovating the same line, so that they do not repeat the same mistake? So how is going to be that defined? Because everything can't be collaborated and everything can't be hidden. So how do you see it as? I mean,
I think it's a fascinating point, and actually one of the principles behind what we've seen behind these large-scale programs is trying to connect together what traditionally have been discrete worlds of research and clinical impact. And we're actually trying to drive a connection between the two with the principle that if you apply something in the clinic, you collect outcomes data that informs an insight that could actually open up a research agenda. It may have fundamentally different objectives around publication as against treating patients, but that could actually be informative of future clinical applications. So it's that connection between the two and accelerating the innovation that may come from a research mindset and encouraging, accelerating the speed with which that may translate into the clinic. And I think the faster that we can manage the data that arises from the two sectors and connect the two, the easier, the faster we'll unlock innovation in that space.
I think that is a fantastic question. It really is, because once you get into the detail of it, if any of you get the chance to read the Made Smarter review, which was one of the industrial challenges that went out there that's under pilot at the minute, it identified the barriers to success for digitalisation, and the biggest barrier to success was data trust and data sharing. And you are absolutely on the money. And I think, my personal opinion, I think it's going to be regulation that is going to support that collaboration. I.e., if you want to operate in this market, if you want to play in this market, we've got to share the data in a specific way. And I'd say when it comes to sharing data, we've got to really be careful, because if we ask for specifics, this is what data we want, we will get the wrong answer. We've got to take a systems view of what we want to do with that data and the benefits to, the efficacy of drugs or whatever else it might be. It's going to be a real issue, and I haven't got the answer, but it's a great question.
There was another question right behind you.
Hi, Ilaria Mirabile, I'm from Cancer Research UK. I think we touched upon the risk of hype with artificial intelligence, big data, and I wonder if a way around this is bringing back the patient centricity. So what can we sort out? What problems can we sort out for patients with the use of artificial intelligence, big data? I think, Paul, you touched on the genomic activities. What is something that we can really achieve in the next 5-10 years for patients?
So certainly from my perspective, and you look at a very large program like the 100,000 Genome Project, as soon as you get one patient who has a confirmed diagnosis and ideally some treatment options that makes a difference to that individual, it potentially helps people understand why it's worth the investment it's worth. So it doesn't necessarily need huge volumes of case studies and impact on individuals for it to have a meaningful effect. And so I think that's an interesting lesson. You don't have to do it in all 100,000, even though that ultimately would be your goal. I think the other key thing is this is the beginning of a process. You're trying to drive innovation at the interface into a system, in this case the healthcare system of the UK, that's notoriously difficult to change and has 1,000,001 other priorities. So how do you set up a governance structure that allows you to drive the innovation, to prove the case, that then you get to a point 3, 4, 5 years later where a certain number or volume is delivered, a case has been made, patients have benefited, there's general support for it. Absolutely take your point around the patient being at the core of this, that's why we do it. But then the principle is, well, go back to my question about how do you then scale it? How do you move from something that's 100,000 to covering the whole of the 50, 60 million population in the UK? And I think it's those questions around governance, structure, use cases, having the core principle of the patient at the centre, but then aligning around the agendas that reinforce how you make the case that will unlock more funding and support at multiple interfaces that's key. And if there's one principle behind the kind of programs I've been involved in over the last 5 to 10 years, it's about having multiple stakeholders at the same table, even if they have differing objectives. And the challenge is managing those different objectives, but keeping all of those stakeholders at the table. Don't allow any one of them to dominate, but allow them all to have their say.
I'd like to take a couple of more questions, if you don't mind. Oh, do you have a quick follow-up?
I was just wondering, are patients around that table?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
No question. Central to it.
Sorry, we have
If
one
you had-
question.
Sorry, just got to follow that. So Natalie this morning from FPA, they are leading on patient first actually, and under her leadership, they're making a strong push that we've got to get back to the patients being first. So one of the FPA initiatives is around making sure patients who volunteer for our clinical trials, that data information can be shared amongst the companies. So if you've got a type of cancer, you're screened for a trial, you're not eligible for that trial, can that patient's data be made available to other companies to allow them to recruit quicker and faster? So that's one FP, a patient-focused initiative, you could see making a difference to how we run clinical trials very quickly, actually.
Actually, there's another really important point, Mark, that you asked earlier about if you get the right consents, you don't necessarily need to collect all the data up front, because you've got the opportunity to re-engage the patient and ask them for more information when you need it. And I think that's another critical component of this. There's a relationship building exercise that's going on here that actually should never stop.
We have time for 2 more questions. One here and then...
Just one comment first. The part where the patients are being followed to see if the clinical trial objectives are being met is something that is happening, right? In the companies, and in fact we have several published cases that they follow, and it happens in the middle of the trial to see that only a very small percentage of the population reacts responds positively to the drug. And then all of a sudden they realize that it is a DNA problem, and then they have to adjust the trial in the middle. And there are all this field now of adjusting clinical trials, adapting clinical trials. So this is happening, right? And it's being followed with certain consensus from the patients and stuff like that. So some of these things, maybe we don't have the appropriate representatives here to answer these questions, but it is happening. And also, the doctors are responsible to report adverse effects. So some of the adverse effects that you find initially in the box, and they say they may have this, and 1 out of 100, they are eventually being modified depending on the responses you get from the doctors. That's one thing. The second thing I want to say...
Can we come to the
that
question?
was not a question, it was a follow-up.
Can we come to the question, because
yes,
we have...
the question is this. We're talking about the big data. And back in 1990 and even 1985, there were companies talking about big data. In fact, there is the Teradata Corporation that they invented the term big data. And at the time, we had started in industry and in universities talking about artificial intelligence. In fact, we're making jokes that is the opposite of natural stupidity, and let's keep doing things. And artificial intelligence and the digital twins, which are essentially simulations, model simulations, they exist out for about 20, 30 years. So my question is, why isn't the pharmaceutical industry looking into what their industries are doing?
Great.
And start collaborating.
Great question.
Right?
Can we get to the answer? Because I think we need to probably wrap up, and I have 2 more gentlemen that want to ask questions. If we have 3 more minutes, shall the panel? Let's collect the two other questions very quickly from you and from the gentleman, or vice versa. And then the panel can pick up the 3 questions.
I'll try to be very, very quick with my question if I can, and that's regarding regulators, in particular things like the MHRA, FDA, and their acceptance of AI data, particularly in modelling, to try and reduce the number of either patients in animals in preclinical and patients in the clinical stage, to try and move through with modelling, particularly with regards to DDI studies and pharmacology.
Great. So there's modeling and simulation in clinical trials. New?
Yeah. So far we've talked about technology disruption. I'm very interested in business model disruption as well. Notice in industries, the touches of it in the discussion around servitization from Mike, but also Dominic talking about changes in driverless cars, carpooling, and the effect that will have on oil demand. Question from my side is perhaps against the backdrop of pharmaceutical industry moving towards an outcomes-based model and the reduction of cost of healthcare overall. What do you think is the best response, or how do you go about finding a good response to these challenges?
Great. Thank you very much. Who wants to start?
I'm going to swim one of a car.
You wanna pick it? The first one?
I'll just go really quickly.
Go on,
you're correct. I just think the markets in the pharmaceutical arena, it's just a bit too conservative. It needs to be a bit bolder in its approach to adopting digital twin type technology. Lots of other markets have it. You heard BP talk about the impact they had on their business. It would have a material impact on the business.
Great.
That's all I need to say.
What about modeling and simulation? Will that ever well, it's already complementing, will it ever replace, or how prominent will modeling and simulation be?
I mean, just picking up on that, we've already done some work within the Pasteur Alliance around working with the regulators around sort of bioinformatics pipelines, because the use of within a clinical decision making, that's another one where the regulators really want to work on a good outcome. So I think it's about, first of all, engaging with the regulators, because they want to actually have a good outcome. So I think we can work on it, but it's going to need the same things, you know, the trust and the validation of those workflows to really make it come true.
Great, thank you. And what about outcome-based modeling on value-based healthcare and disease management, the role of pharma beyond, let's say, the pill, business model innovation? Anyone want to take that?
Quick comment from me, Marco, then on business. I completely agree. I go back to my point about adjacent possibles. I think that opens up different business models. You see it at the two extremes, population genomics, government-sponsored initiative, and consumer genomics like the 23andMe's. Fundamentally different business models that ultimately will converge, and the overlap is a fascinating area to explore.
Mike,
I'd go back to what Eric said around, you know, gene therapy, rare diseases, and cell therapies. And antimicrobial resistance. I think we're going to have a different business model. Yeah. Simple as that. The current patent pay just doesn't work. So it'd be interesting to see how that develops in the coming years. And is there the political will around the world to address that?
And then from the energy sector, business model disruption is going to be pretty kind of fundamental. People, the demographic shift in moving from owning cars to, if you like, kind of just renting space in. At the moment, it's kind of cars that are driven by humans, but it ultimately will be autonomous cars. And actually, how does a company like ours offer kind of fleet management services to vehicle autonomy in a new world? So it's way beyond just the kind of the technologies into very, very new businesses. And we ignore the kind of the business model disruption at our peril, and not just to focus on the technology.
Great, thank you, Dominic. Last word, Mike, and we'll wrap up on business model disruption.
I'll finish with a really nice anecdote. I saw an advert this year, and it was for a washing machine. And the washing machine was, you didn't buy it, you paid per wash. And what was really interesting on that pay per wash is that you didn't even buy washing up detergent. So you are now, so just imagine if you're producing those capsules for washing up, for washing your clothes, all of a sudden you disrupted the market to the point where you can no longer supply into that supply chain. And that's a real wake up for those organizations out there. And I think, you know, pharmaceutical companies need to recognize that as well. Those models are coming.
That's great. So I thank you, the panelists. A very interesting discussion. A round of applause for everyone.